The moment Sarah Cunningham stumbled through the saloon doors with dried blood on her dress and accusations of theft falling from the sheriff's lips, she knew her life in Tombstone, Arizona territory was over. It was the summer of 1882, and the silver mining town thrived on gossip as much as it did on ore. Sarah had arrived 6 months earlier from Philadelphia, a young woman of 22, with hopes of teaching at the newly established schoolhouse. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper, green eyes that reflected an intelligence uncommon in these parts, and a stubborn streak that had gotten her into trouble more than once. But she was honest, hard-working, and had never stolen so much as a penny in her life. The accusations came from Marcus Holloway, the wealthy mine owner who had taken an unwelcome interest in her. When Sarah rejected his advances for the third time, refusing to become his mistress despite his promises of silk dresses and a fine house, she should have known there would be consequences. Men like Holloway were not accustomed to hearing the word no, especially not from a woman with no family and no connections in this unforgiving territory. The missing gold coins appeared in her room at the boarding house where she lived. Mrs. Henderson, the landlady, discovered them tucked beneath Sarah's mattress during what she claimed was a routine cleaning. The sheriff arrived within the hour, and a crowd gathered as Sarah was dragged into the street. She protested her innocence, her voice breaking as she explained that someone had planted the evidence, but nobody wanted to listen. Holloway stood on the porch of his office across the street, watching with cold satisfaction as the mob formed. In Tombstone, theft was a serious crime, but stealing from Marcus Holloway was something else entirely. He owned half the town, employed most of the men, and had the law in his pocket. The sheriff, a portly man named Dawson, who owed his position to Holloway's influence, declared that Sarah would face trial. But the crowd had other ideas. Fueled by whiskey and the excitement that came from having a spectacle to break up the monotony of their days, they began to call for immediate justice. Sarah stood in the middle of the street, her hands bound with rough rope that cut into her wrists, and felt true fear for the first time in her life. She had read about frontier justice in the newspapers back east, but experiencing it was something altogether different. The faces around her were twisted with anger and righteousness, and she realized that the truth did not matter here. What mattered was that Marcus Holloway wanted her punished, and these people were eager to oblige him. A woman named Delilah Burns, who ran one of the brothels and had her own reasons for currying favor with Holloway, stepped forward and suggested a punishment that made Sarah's blood run cold. They would take her out into the Sonoran Desert and leave her there with nothing. No food, no water, no horse. If God saw fit to spare her, she could find her way to salvation. If not, the desert would be her judge and executioner. The crowd roared its approval. It was cruel enough to satisfy their bloodlust, but allowed them to maintain the fiction that they were not murderers. They were simply letting nature take its course. Sarah tried to speak, to plead for mercy, or at least a fair trial, but her voice was drowned out by the jeering mob. Sheriff Dawson made a half-hearted attempt to restore order, suggesting they at least wait until morning, but Holloway himself descended from his porch and declared that the sentence should be carried out immediately. They threw her into the back of a wagon. Sarah's mind raced, searching for some way to escape, but there were too many of them, and her hands were still bound. The wagon lurched forward, and she watched Tombstone recede into the distance. Most of the crowd dispersed, their entertainment over, but a handful of men accompanied the wagon to ensure the sentence was carried out properly. The ride lasted 2 hours, carrying her deeper into the merciless terrain where the saguaro cacti stood like silent witnesses, and the heat shimmered in waves above the cracked earth. When they finally stopped, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. They cut the ropes from her wrists, leaving her skin raw and bleeding, and pushed her out of the wagon. Sarah stumbled and fell to her knees in the sand. One of the men, a ranch hand named Pete, who had always seemed decent enough, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Another man, drunk and mean-spirited, spat near her feet and told her she got what she deserved. The wagon turned around and headed back toward town. Sarah stood alone in the vast emptiness, watching until it disappeared from view. Only then did she allow herself to cry. The tears came hot and fast, running down her cheeks and dripping onto her already dusty dress. She was alone in the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back, no food, no water, and no idea which direction might lead to salvation. But Sarah Cunningham had not traveled across the country alone, had not built a new life in a strange town, and had not stood up to Marcus Holloway just to die without a fight. She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand and forced herself to think. The sun was setting in the west, which meant that east lay behind her. Tombstone was northwest of where she stood, but she would find no help there. Her best chance was to head south toward the Mexican border, where small settlements and ranches dotted the landscape. It would be a long walk, perhaps impossible, but it was her only option. She began walking as the sun dipped below the horizon, knowing that traveling at night would be cooler and might preserve what little strength she had. The desert transformed as darkness fell, becoming a place of shadows and strange sounds. Coyotes howled in the distance, and small creatures rustled through the brush. Sarah kept moving, one foot in front of the other, trying not to think about her thirst or the growing ache in her legs. What she did not know was that someone had witnessed her exile from Tombstone. His name was James Dalton, and he was a cowboy in the truest sense of the word. At 28 years old, he had spent the past decade driving cattle across the open range, working ranches from Texas to California, and living a life of solitude that suited his temperament. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar, weathered skin from years under the sun, and gray eyes that missed very little. James had been in Tombstone only a few days, having delivered a small herd to a buyer, and planning to move on as soon as the business was concluded. He kept to himself, staying at a different boarding house than Sarah, and spending his evenings at a quiet saloon on the edge of town. He had noticed Sarah before, had seen her walking to the schoolhouse with books under her arm, and had been struck by the determined set of her shoulders and the way she held her head high, despite the rough and tumble nature of the town. When the commotion began that afternoon, James had been checking on his horses at the livery stable. He heard the shouting and walked over to see what was happening, arriving just in time to witness Sarah being thrown into the wagon. Something about the scene troubled him deeply. He had seen frontier justice before and understood that sometimes the law was rough out here, but there was something wrong about this particular situation. The woman did not have the look of a thief, and the eagerness with which the crowd condemned her spoke of something darker at work. James was not the type of man to involve himself in other people's affairs. He had learned long ago that survival in the West often meant keeping your head down and your opinions to yourself. But as he watched the wagon roll out of town with Sarah in the back, something stirred in his chest that he had not felt in years. It might have been compassion or a sense of justice, or perhaps something else he could not quite name. Whatever it was, it compelled him to act. He went back to the livery stable and saddled his horse, a strong bay gelding named Ranger, who had carried him across thousands of miles. He packed supplies quickly, including extra water and food, and set out following the wagon's tracks. He kept his distance, not wanting to be seen by the men who were carrying out the sentence, and followed the trail through the desert as the sun began to set. When James reached the spot where they had abandoned Sarah, he found it empty. He dismounted and examined the ground, his experienced eyes reading the story written in the sand. He could see where she had fallen, where she had stood for several minutes, and the direction she had begun walking. South. She was heading south, which showed more intelligence than most people would have credited her with in such circumstances. He remounted and followed her tracks, moving slowly in the gathering darkness. James had tracked cattle, horses, and even fugitives during his years on the range, and following one woman's footprints through the desert was well within his abilities. The moon rose full and bright, providing enough light to see by, and he continued his pursuit with steady determination. Sarah had been walking for perhaps 3 hours when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Terror seized her heart, and she thought at first that the men from Tombstone had returned to finish what they had started. She looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the desert offered little cover. The footsteps grew closer, and she turned to face whoever was coming, determined to meet her fate standing upright. A lone rider emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. He pulled his horse to a stop several yards away, and Sarah could see that he was tall and broad-shouldered, though his face remained in shadow. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah's throat was already parched from thirst and fear, and she could not have formed words if she tried. The rider dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he did not want to frighten her. When he spoke, his voice was low and gentle, surprising her with its kindness. "Miss, my name is James Dalton. I saw what happened in Tombstone. I brought water and supplies. I mean you no harm." Sarah wanted to believe him, but trust had been violently stripped from her that day. She took a step backward, her legs shaking with exhaustion. "Why would you help me? Everyone else wanted me dead." James pulled a canteen from his saddle and held it out to her. "Not everyone. I do not know what you did or did not do, but leaving someone to die of thirst in the desert does not sit right with me. Will you take the water?" She hesitated only a moment longer before her desperate thirst overcame her caution. She stumbled forward and took the canteen with trembling hands, drinking deeply. The water was warm from the day's heat, but tasted like salvation itself. She drank until James gently pulled the canteen back. "Not too much at once. You will make yourself sick." Sarah nodded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Now that he was closer, she could see his face in the moonlight. He had strong features with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun, and an expression that seemed genuinely concerned. There was something solid and dependable about him, something that made her want to trust him despite everything that had happened. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I did not steal anything. They set me up because I refused Marcus Holloway's advances. He wanted me to be his mistress, and when I said no, he made sure I would be punished." James nodded slowly. "I thought it might be something like that. Holloway has a reputation for getting what he wants, and he does not handle rejection well. But it does not matter to me whether you are guilty or innocent. No one deserves to die like this." His words brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. For the first time since the nightmare began, she was not alone. Someone believed her, or at least cared enough to help her regardless of belief. It was more than she had dared to hope for. "What will you do now?" she asked. "If you help me, Holloway will not forget it. He has a long reach, and he does not forgive easily." James looked back in the direction of Tombstone, his jaw tightening. "I was planning to move on anyway. This just gives me a reason to do it sooner. As for you, I can take you to a town called Tucson, about 70 miles from here. It is big enough that Holloway's influence will not reach, and you might be able to find work there. Start over." Sarah felt a surge of hope at his words. A new start was exactly what she needed, and Tucson was far enough away that she might truly escape Marcus Holloway's vengeance. But doubt crept in quickly. "Why would you do this for a stranger? You could get yourself killed." James was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice held a note of something Sarah could not quite identify. "Maybe because I know what it is like to be alone in the world. Maybe because I have seen too much injustice and done too little about it. Or maybe because when I saw you being taken away, something told me I needed to help. Does the reason matter?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I suppose it does not. I am grateful, more than I can say." James gestured toward his horse. "We should keep moving. They might send someone to check on you, make sure the desert finished the job. We need to put as much distance between us and Tombstone as possible." But Sarah's legs finally gave out, and she sank to the ground. The combination of fear, exhaustion, and dehydration had drained every ounce of strength from her body. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I cannot walk any farther." Without hesitation, James stepped forward and scooped her up in his arms. She was too tired to protest as he carried her to his horse and carefully lifted her into the saddle. He mounted behind her, his arms on either side as he took the reins, and she found herself leaning back against his chest. He was warm and solid, and despite the strangeness of the situation, she felt safe for the first time in hours. They rode through the night, moving at a steady pace that covered ground without exhausting the horse. James stopped several times to let Sarah drink more water and to allow Ranger to rest. During these stops, they spoke little, but Sarah found comfort in his presence. He did not press her for details about what had happened, did not judge or question her. He simply helped, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. As dawn broke across the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, James guided them toward a small outcropping of rocks that would provide shade during the heat of the day. He helped Sarah down from the horse and spread out a bedroll for her to rest on. From his saddlebags, he produced dried beef and hardtack, which they shared in silence. "You should sleep," James said. "We will travel again tonight when it is cooler. Tucson is still several days away, and you need to regain your strength." Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of just how exhausted she was. But as she lay down on the bedroll, a question formed in her mind. "James, What were you doing in Tombstone? You do not seem like the type to spend much time in town." He sat down nearby, his back against a rock, and tipped his hat down over his eyes. "I was delivering cattle, just passing through, like I usually am. I do not stay in one place very long." "Why not?" He was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. "I had a home once, a long time ago, a ranch in Texas with my family. Raiders came through when I was 18, killed my parents and burned everything to the ground. I have been moving ever since, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. It is easier that way." Sarah's heart ached at the pain in his words. She understood loss, had felt it when her own parents died of fever when she was 19, leaving her alone in the world. It was that loss that had driven her west, searching for a fresh start and a place to belong. Now she was fleeing again, cast out into the desert like refuse, but this time she was not alone. "I am sorry," she said softly. "That must have been terrible." James shifted slightly, pushing his hat back to look at her. "It was a long time ago. I learned to live with it. Now you should rest. We have a long journey ahead." Sarah closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind kept replaying the events of the previous day, the accusations and the hatred in the faces of people she had thought were her neighbors. But mixed in with those dark memories was the image of James riding through the darkness to find her, his voice gentle as he offered her water and hope. She had been so certain that she would die alone in the desert, and yet here she was, protected by a man who had no reason to care whether she lived or died, except for his own sense of what was right. When she finally slept, her dreams were troubled, but not nightmarish. And when she woke in the late afternoon, she found that James had been keeping watch, his rifle across his lap, and his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of pursuit. He had kept her safe while she slept, and that realization stirred something warm in her chest. They continued their journey that evening, falling into a pattern that would sustain them for the next several days. They traveled by night to avoid the worst of the heat, rested during the day in whatever shade they could find, and spoke in quiet conversations that gradually revealed more about who they were. Sarah told James about her life in Philadelphia, about her love of teaching, and her dreams of making a difference in the lives of children. She described the hope she had felt when she accepted the position in Tombstone, and the bitter disappointment when Marcus Holloway turned her dream into a nightmare. James listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, and Sarah found herself grateful for his quiet attention. In turn, James shared stories of his years on the range, the places he had seen, and the people he had met. He spoke of sleeping under the stars with nothing but his horse for company, of driving cattle through rivers and across mountains, of the freedom and loneliness that came with a life spent in motion. Sarah heard the longing in his voice when he mentioned the ranch his family had owned, the home he had lost. And she understood that despite his claims to prefer solitude, James Dalton was a man who had been searching for something to belong to for the past 10 years. On the third night, they encountered their first real danger. They were crossing an open stretch of desert when the sound of gunfire echoed across the landscape. James immediately spurred Ranger toward a cluster of rocks, dismounting quickly and pulling Sarah down beside him. He drew his rifle and scanned the darkness, his body tense and alert. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Could be bandits or maybe Apache. Either way, we do not want to be caught in the open." Sarah pressed herself against the rocks, her heart pounding. She had heard stories about Apache raids and outlaw gangs that preyed on travelers in the desert, but hearing about danger and experiencing it were two very different things. She watched as James positioned himself to have a clear view of the surrounding area, his rifle ready, his movements confident and controlled. The gunfire came again, closer this time, followed by shouting. James squinted into the darkness, then relaxed slightly. "It is a fight between two groups, probably over territory or stolen goods. They are not coming this way. We will wait until they move on, then circle around them." They waited in tense silence for nearly an hour, as the sounds of conflict gradually faded into the distance. When James was satisfied that it was safe, they remounted and continued their journey, taking a longer route to avoid any chance of running into whoever had been fighting. The incident left Sarah shaken, but also impressed by James's calm competence. He had not panicked or taken unnecessary risks, had simply assessed the situation and acted to keep them safe. She found herself studying him as they rode, noticing the way he held himself in the saddle, the easy confidence in his movements. the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. This was a man who knew how to survive in a harsh world, and she felt fortunate that he had chosen to help her. By the fourth day, Sarah's initial exhaustion had begun to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of the man who had saved her life. She noticed small things about James, the way he always made sure she drank and ate before he did, how he would spread his bedroll in a position where he could keep watch while she slept, the gentle way he helped her mount and dismount from the horse. He was kind without being condescending, protective without being overbearing, and as the miles passed, Sarah found herself drawn to him in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. James, for his part, was discovering that having a companion on the trail was not the burden he might have expected. Sarah was resilient and brave, complaining little despite the hardships they faced. She had a quick wit and an intelligence that showed in their conversations, and he found himself looking forward to their quiet talks during the cool desert evenings. More than once, he caught himself watching her as she slept, noticing the way the moonlight caught in her auburn hair, the delicate curve of her cheek, the strength in her features even in repose. He tried to tell himself that what he felt was simple compassion, that any decent person would have helped her, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Sarah Cunningham had awakened something in him that he had thought long dead, a desire for connection and companionship that went beyond the lonely existence he had built for himself. It frightened him, this growing attachment, because attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of loss. He had lost his family, his home, everything he had cared about, and he had sworn never to let himself care that deeply again. But Sarah was making it difficult to keep that promise. On their fifth night, they stopped near a small stream that ran through a canyon, a rare source of fresh water in the arid landscape. James declared they would rest there for a full day, allowing both Sarah and the horse to recover their strength before the final push to Tucson. Sarah took the opportunity to wash her face and hands in the cool water, scrubbing away days of dust and grime. She was acutely aware of her bedraggled appearance, her dress torn and stained, her hair a tangled mess. But when she looked up and saw James watching her, there was no disgust or pity in his eyes. There was something else, something warm and admiring that made her breath catch. That evening, as they sat by a small fire James had built, the conversation turned more personal. Sarah had been gathering her courage to ask a question that had been on her mind for days. "James, when we reach Tucson, what will you do? Will you stay there, or will you move on again?" He poked at the fire with a stick, not meeting her eyes. "I had planned to head up to Colorado. There is work on the ranches there, and I heard they are looking for experienced hands." "Why do you ask?" Sarah took a breath, knowing she was about to reveal more than was perhaps wise. "Because I have been thinking about what happens when we arrive. You have done so much for me, saved my life, and I do not know how I will ever repay you. But more than that, I have been wondering if perhaps we might continue on together. If you wanted to, I mean. I could find work in Colorado as easily as in Tucson, and I thought maybe we could travel together, as companions." James looked up at her, surprise evident on his face. "Sarah, you do not owe me anything. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected payment or gratitude." "I know that," Sarah said quickly. "But this is not about obligation. It is about the fact that I have enjoyed your company these past days. You are a good man, James Dalton, and I find myself reluctant to say goodbye when we reach Tucson. If you would rather travel alone, I understand. But I wanted you to know that I would welcome your continued companionship." The silence that followed felt interminable. James stared into the fire, his expression unreadable, and Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She had been too forward, had presumed too much, and now he was trying to think of a way to let her down gently. But when James finally spoke, his words surprised her. "I have been thinking the same thing," he admitted quietly. "These past days with you have been different from any I can remember. I have spent 10 years keeping everyone at arm's length, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections, and I thought that was what I wanted. But being with you has made me realize how lonely I have been. I would like nothing more than to continue traveling with you, Sarah, to Colorado or anywhere else you want to go." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "Truly?" "Truly," James confirmed, and when he smiled at her, it transformed his face, making him look younger and lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. We will go to Tucson so you can get proper supplies and clothing, and then we will head north together. I know a ranch in Colorado where they would hire us both. You could teach the ranch hands children, and I could work with the cattle. It would be a good life." Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Just days ago, she had been cast out to die alone, and now she was being offered not just survival, but the possibility of a real life with a man who made her feel things she had never felt before. It was too much, too wonderful, and she found herself laughing through her tears. "What is so funny?" James asked, though he was smiling too. "Nothing. Everything. A week ago, I thought my life was over, and now I'm sitting here with you, planning a future I never imagined. It is overwhelming in the best possible way." James stood and crossed to where she sat, holding out his hand. When she took it, he pulled her to her feet, and they stood facing each other in the firelight. He was close enough that Sarah could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Sarah," he said softly, "I need you to know that my feelings for you go beyond simple companionship. I have not felt this way about anyone in more years than I can count, and I am not entirely sure what to do about it, but I think you should know the truth before we make any plans together." Sarah's heart was racing so fast, she thought it might burst from her chest. "What are you saying, James?" "I am saying that I care about you, deeply. I am saying that when I think about the future now, I see you in it, not just as a traveling companion, but as something more. If that frightens you, or if you do not feel the same way, I will respect that, but I cannot pretend anymore that what I feel is just concern for your well-being." Sarah reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm. "It does not frighten me," she whispered, "because I feel the same way. I have been trying to tell myself it is too soon, that we barely know each other, but my heart does not seem to care about logic. I care for you too, James, more than I thought possible in such a short time." He covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his face. "Then we will figure this out together. Take things as they come and see where this leads us. Does that sound good to you?" "It sounds perfect." James leaned down and kissed her then, gentle and tentative at first, as though he was afraid she might pull away. But Sarah leaned into him, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with all the emotion that had been building inside her for days. It was sweet and passionate and filled with promise, a kiss that spoke of new beginnings and second chances. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I would feel this way again. After losing my family, I convinced myself that I was better off alone. But you have changed something in me, Sarah. You have given me hope." "You saved my life," Sarah replied, "in more ways than one. I will be grateful for that every day." They stood together in the firelight, holding each other, and for the first time since being cast out into the desert, Sarah felt truly safe, not just physically safe, but emotionally secure in a way she had not experienced since her parents died. James had not just found her in the desert. He had found a part of her that had been lost, a capacity for trust and love that she had thought destroyed by Marcus Holloway's cruelty. The next morning, they continued their journey toward Tucson with renewed purpose. The miles seemed shorter now, the desert less hostile, because they were traveling together toward a shared future. They talked about their plans, about the ranch in Colorado, and the life they might build there. James described the mountains and the crisp air, so different from the harsh desert landscape, and Sarah imagined teaching in a small schoolhouse with snow-capped peaks visible through the windows. But as they drew closer to Tucson, James became more cautious. They were still in territory where Marcus Holloway's influence might reach, and there was always the possibility that word of Sarah's exile had spread. He insisted they approach the town carefully, scouting it first to make sure there were no wanted posters or bounties on Sarah's head. They arrived on the outskirts of Tucson on their 7th day of travel, and James left Sarah hidden in a small grove of cottonwood trees, while he rode into town to assess the situation. Sarah waited anxiously, every minute feeling like an hour, until she finally saw him riding back toward her. The smile on his face told her everything she needed to know. "It is safe," he said as he dismounted. "Holloway's reach does not extend this far, and nobody seems to know anything about what happened in Tombstone. You are free here." Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that her knees went weak. She was free, truly free. Marcus Holloway could not touch her here, could not destroy the new life she was building. James caught her as she swayed, steadying her with his strong arms, and she looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "It is over," she said. "The nightmare is finally over." "It is over," James confirmed. "Now we can start fresh, together." They rode into Tucson side by side, and Sarah marveled at the size of the town. It was much larger than Tombstone, with broad streets and numerous shops and businesses. James took her to a hotel where she could bathe and rest while he made arrangements for their journey north. He purchased new clothes for her, a practical riding outfit suitable for traveling, and when she emerged from her room, cleaned and dressed, he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. "You are beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made Sarah's heart flutter. They spent 2 days in Tucson, restocking their supplies and allowing themselves the luxury of real beds and hot meals. During that time, they continued to grow closer, stealing moments together whenever they could. James was patient and respectful, never pushing for more than Sarah was ready to give, but the attraction between them was undeniable and growing stronger with each passing hour. On their last evening in Tucson, James took Sarah to a small restaurant where they could have a proper meal together. As they sat across from each other at a table covered with a checkered cloth, Sarah looked at the man who had saved her and felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. She loved him. It was too soon, too fast, but it was true nonetheless. She loved James Dalton with every fiber of her being. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, noticing her expression. Sarah smiled. "I am thinking about how lucky I am. A week ago, I thought I would die alone in the desert. Now, I am sitting here with you, about to start a new life in Colorado. It feels like a dream." James reached across the table and took her hand. "It is not a dream. It is real, and it is just the beginning. Sarah, there is something I want to ask you, and you can say no if it is too soon, or if you do not feel ready. But I need to know where we stand before we leave Tucson." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What is it?" James took a deep breath. "I want you to marry me. I know we have only known each other for a week, and by all rights, that should not be enough time to make such a decision. But I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in my life. I love you, Sarah. I love your strength and your courage and your kind heart. I love the way you look at the world and the way you make me want to be a better man. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, if you will have me." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so widely that her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, James, I will marry you. I love you too, more than I knew it was possible to love someone. You saved my life, but more than that, you gave me a reason to want to live. I want to marry you and build a life with you and face whatever comes together." James stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply right there in the restaurant, not caring who might be watching. Sarah kissed him back, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into that kiss. And when they finally pulled apart, the other diners were applauding. They found a preacher the next morning and were married in a simple ceremony with 2 strangers pulled in from the street to serve as witnesses. Sarah wore her new dress, and James had cleaned up as best he could, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, they sealed their vows with a kiss that promised forever. After the ceremony, they went to a general store where James purchased a simple gold band for Sarah's finger. It was not fancy or expensive, but when he slipped it onto her hand, Sarah thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a symbol of their commitment, a tangible reminder that she was no longer alone in the world. That night, they consummated their marriage in the hotel room James had rented. It was Sarah's first time with a man, and James was gentle and patient, taking his time to make sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Sarah rested her head on James's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For everything. For finding me, for saving me, for loving me, for giving me a future when I thought I had none." James stroked her hair, his touch tender. "I should be thanking you. You gave me something I thought I had lost forever. A reason to hope, a reason to stay in one place, a reason to believe that I could have a home again. You are my home now, Sarah Dalton. Wherever you are, that is where I belong." Sarah smiled against his skin, loving the sound of her new name, Sarah Dalton. It felt right, as though she had finally found the place where she was meant to be. Not a physical place, but a person. James was her home, just as she was his. They left Tucson 3 days after their wedding and began the long journey north to Colorado. The trip took several weeks as they traveled at a leisurely pace, stopping to camp in beautiful locations and taking time to simply enjoy being together. They crossed deserts and plains, climbed into foothills, and eventually into mountains. And with each mile, Sarah felt the shadow of Marcus Holloway and Tombstone receding further behind her. James was an attentive husband, always making sure Sarah was comfortable and happy. He taught her to ride better, to build a fire, to read the signs of weather in the sky. Sarah, in turn, shared with him her love of books and learning, reading aloud to him from a volume of poetry she had managed to keep throughout her ordeal. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's dreams and fears, building a foundation of understanding and trust. When they finally arrived at the ranch James had mentioned, a sprawling property nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains, they were greeted warmly by the owner, a gruff but kind man named Thomas McAllister. James had worked for McAllister several years earlier and had earned the older man's respect through his hard work and skill with cattle. McAllister was delighted to hire James back and was equally pleased to learn that Sarah was a qualified teacher. The ranch employed dozens of hands, many of whom had children who needed educating, and McAllister had been trying to find a teacher for months. He offered them a small cabin on the property, a simple but sturdy structure with 2 rooms and a fireplace, and said they could make it their home for as long as they wanted to stay. Sarah and James moved into the cabin and spent the next several weeks making it truly theirs. They patched the roof and chinked the gaps between the logs, built furniture from scrap wood, and planted a small garden. Sarah established a schoolhouse in an unused barn, and soon she had 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. James returned to the work he knew best, helping to manage the ranch's large herd of cattle and earning a reputation as one of the best cowboys McAllister had ever employed. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Sarah would wake early and prepare breakfast while James tended to the morning chores. They would eat together, often in comfortable silence, before James headed out to the range and Sarah walked to the schoolhouse. In the evenings, they would reunite in their cabin, sharing the events of their days over dinner, and then spending quiet hours reading or talking by the fire. As the months passed, their love deepened and matured. The initial passion remained, but it was joined by something steadier and more enduring. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals. They learned to work together, to support each other through difficult times, and to celebrate each other's successes. Sarah thrived in her role as teacher. She loved her students and poured her energy into giving them the education they deserved. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, and saw the spark of curiosity ignite in young minds. Several of her students showed remarkable aptitude, and Sarah began working with them individually, pushing them to reach their full potential. James found satisfaction in his work as well, but more than that, he found peace. For the first time since his family's death, he had a home again. Not just a place to sleep, but a real home with a wife he loved and a community he was part of. The restlessness that had driven him for so many years gradually faded, replaced by a deep contentment that showed in everything he did. Winter came to the Colorado mountains, blanketing everything in snow and bringing an early end to the working day. James and Sarah spent long evenings in their cabin, snuggled together for warmth. And it was during one of these evenings that Sarah shared news that would change their lives forever. "James," she said softly, her hand on his arm, "I need to tell you something. I am with child." James sat up so quickly he nearly knocked over the chair he had been sitting in. "You are? Truly?" Sarah nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Truly, I am about 3 months along, I think. The baby should come sometime in late spring." James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly and burying his face in her hair. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Sarah, I cannot believe it. We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though she could already hear the answer in his voice. "Happy does not begin to cover it," James said, pulling back to look at her. "I am overwhelmed and terrified and more excited than I have ever been in my life. A baby. Our family is growing." They talked late into the night about their hopes and dreams for their child, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, about all the ways their lives would change. James was both thrilled and nervous about becoming a father, worried that he might not know how to do it right, but Sarah assured him that they would figure it out together, just as they had figured out everything else. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, James became even more attentive and protective. He insisted she reduce her workload at the school, taking over many of the physical tasks like hauling firewood and water. Sarah tried to protest that she was perfectly capable, but she secretly loved his fussing. It was a tangible expression of how much he cared for her and their unborn child. Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and budding trees, and with it came the growing anticipation of the baby's arrival. Sarah continued teaching until she was too uncomfortable to stand for long periods, at which point she reluctantly agreed to take a leave of absence. She spent her days preparing the cabin for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, and daydreaming about what their child would look like. Thomas McAllister's wife, Margaret, a motherly woman in her 50s, took Sarah under her wing and shared the wisdom gleaned from raising 5 children of her own. She promised to be there when Sarah's time came, and her calm confidence helped ease Sarah's fears about childbirth. On a warm day in May, Sarah went into labor. James, who had faced down storms and stampedes without flinching, was suddenly a nervous wreck. He paced outside the cabin, while Margaret and another ranch wife attended to Sarah, and every cry of pain that came from inside nearly drove him mad with worry. But when Margaret finally opened the door and told him he could come in, all his fear vanished. Sarah was propped up in their bed, exhausted and sweaty, but glowing with joy, and in her arms was a tiny red-faced baby wrapped in a blanket. "It is a boy," Sarah said, her voice hoarse but happy. "James, we have a son." James approached the bed slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny person who was now part of their family. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small mewing sounds as he wriggled in Sarah's arms. James felt his throat tighten with emotion as he reached out and gently touched the baby's impossibly small hand. The tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, gripping with surprising strength, and James felt something break open in his chest. "He is perfect," James whispered. "Sarah, he is absolutely perfect. Do you want to hold him?" James nodded, unable to speak, and carefully took his son from Sarah's arms. The baby felt impossibly light and fragile, and James held him as though he might break, but as he looked down into the scrunched-up face, he felt a love so powerful it was almost painful. This was his son, his and Sarah's, a living symbol of their love and their future. They named him Daniel Thomas Dalton, after James's father and the ranch owner who had given them a chance at a new life. Baby Daniel was healthy and loud, making his presence known at all hours of the day and night, and Sarah and James adjusted to their new roles as parents with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. James proved to be a devoted father. He would wake in the night when Daniel cried, walking the baby around the cabin and singing to him in a surprisingly good baritone. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving little horses into the wood, and spent hours just watching his son sleep, marveling at the miracle of his existence. Sarah watched her husband with their child and felt her love for him grow even deeper. James had been so certain he could never have a family again, could never risk caring that much, and yet here he was, completely devoted to their son. It was beautiful to witness. As Daniel grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby, life at the ranch continued to be good. Sarah returned to teaching part-time, bringing Daniel with her to the schoolhouse where he became the unofficial class mascot. The older students took turns helping to watch him, and Daniel thrived with all the attention. James continued his work with the cattle, but he never missed an opportunity to be with his family. He would come home in the evenings, dusty and tired, and immediately scoop Daniel up in his arms, tossing him gently in the air until the baby shrieked with laughter. Then he would kiss Sarah and help prepare dinner, and they would sit together as a family, talking about their days and making plans for the future. When Daniel was a year old, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was less of a shock, but no less exciting. James was thrilled at the prospect of a second child, and Daniel was too young to understand what was happening, but seemed to sense the excitement in the air. Their daughter was born in the autumn, when the leaves on the aspen trees turned gold and the air grew crisp and cool. Sarah's labor was shorter and easier this time, and when Margaret placed the tiny girl in Sarah's arms, Sarah looked at her daughter's delicate features and felt her heart expand to make room for even more love. "What shall we name her?" James asked, sitting beside Sarah on the bed and gazing at his daughter with wonder. "I was thinking, Grace," Sarah said. "Grace Elizabeth Dalton. What do you think?" "I think it is perfect," James said. Hello, Grace. Welcome to the world. Grace was a calmer baby than Daniel had been, content to lie in her cradle and observe the world with wide, curious eyes. Daniel, now a toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to be involved in everything concerning her. Sarah and James had to keep a close eye on him to make sure his enthusiastic affection did not overwhelm the baby. But it was clear that Daniel adored his little sister. The years passed swiftly, filled with the joys and challenges of raising children and building a life together. Daniel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses and followed his father around whenever possible. Grace was quieter, but equally intelligent, showing an early aptitude for reading and learning that made Sarah's teacher's heart swell with pride. Sarah continued to teach, and her schoolhouse became known throughout the region for the quality of education it provided. Parents from neighboring ranches would sometimes board their children during the week so they could attend Sarah's school, and she took pride in knowing that she was making a difference in these children's lives. James became foreman of the ranch when the previous foreman retired, a promotion that came with increased responsibilities and better pay. He was respected by the other ranch hands for his fairness and his skill, and Thomas McAllister often said that James was the best foreman he had ever had. But despite their success and the fullness of their lives, Sarah and James never forgot the circumstances that had brought them together. Sometimes, on quiet evenings after the children were in bed, they would sit on the porch of their cabin and talk about that night in the desert when James had followed her tracks and found her dying of thirst. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not seen them take you from Tombstone?" James asked during one such conversation. "If I had been somewhere else that day, or if I had decided it was not my concern?" Sarah shivered and moved closer to him. "I try not to think about it. I would have died out there, alone and afraid. But you did see, and you did follow, and you saved me. You gave me everything I have now, a home, a family, a life worth living." "You gave me the same," James said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I was existing before I met you, but I was not really living. You taught me that it is possible to love again after loss, that opening your heart is worth the risk. You and our children are the best thing that ever happened to me." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling content and loved. "I wish I could thank that terrified woman stumbling through the desert. Tell her that everything will be all right, that the worst night of her life will lead to the best years." "She would not believe you," James said with a soft laugh, "but she would be glad to hear it." As their children grew older, Sarah and James made sure they understood the story of how their parents had met. They did not hide the difficult parts, the injustice and the cruelty, but they emphasized the themes of courage, compassion, and second chances. They wanted Daniel and Grace to understand that life could be hard and unfair, but that good people could make a difference, that choosing to help someone in need was always the right choice. Daniel listened to the story with wide eyes and declared that he wanted to be like his father, brave and strong and always willing to help. Grace, more thoughtful, asked questions about why people had been so cruel to Sarah, and Sarah used it as a teaching moment about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. When Daniel was 10 and Grace was 9, they welcomed a third child into their family, another son they named William. His arrival was unexpected but joyful, and Daniel and Grace embraced their roles as older siblings with enthusiasm. William was a happy, easygoing baby who seemed to bring even more light into their already bright home. By this time, James and Sarah had saved enough money to purchase a piece of land adjacent to the ranch. Thomas McAllister, now elderly and preparing to pass the ranch to his own son, sold them 50 acres at a favorable price, recognizing that James and Sarah were as much family as employees. They built a larger house on the property, one with enough room for their growing family, but they kept the original cabin as well, a reminder of where they had started. The new house had a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set behind the mountains. It had a large kitchen where Sarah could teach Grace to bake, and a workshop where James could teach Daniel and William to work with wood and leather. It was a home filled with laughter and love, a stark contrast to the loneliness that both Sarah and James had known before they found each other. As the children grew into teenagers, they each developed their own interests and talents. Daniel did indeed follow in his father's footsteps, becoming an excellent horseman and cattleman. At 18, he was already being sought after by neighboring ranches for his skills, but he chose to stay and work with his father, building the small herd of cattle they had started on their own land. Grace, true to her early promise, loved learning and teaching. At 16, she began assisting her mother at the schoolhouse, and Sarah could see that her daughter would one day make an excellent teacher herself. Grace talked about perhaps going to Denver for further education, and while the thought of her leaving was bittersweet, Sarah and James were determined to support her dreams. William, the youngest, was still finding his way. At 8 years old, he showed an interest in everything, trying his hand at ranching like Daniel, reading voraciously like Grace, and displaying an artistic talent that surprised everyone when he began sketching the landscape and animals around them with remarkable skill. Through it all, Sarah and James remained each other's anchor and support. Their love had not faded with time, but had instead deepened and matured into something unshakable. They still stole moments alone when they could, still looked at each other with the wonder and gratitude of two people who knew how easily they might never have met. On their 20th wedding anniversary, James surprised Sarah by taking her back to Tucson. They left the children in the capable hands of Daniel, who was now 21 and more than able to manage things for a week, and made the long journey south. Sarah was curious about what James had planned, but he refused to tell her, saying only that he wanted to show her something. When they arrived in Tucson, James led her to the small restaurant where he had proposed all those years ago. It was still there, remarkably unchanged, and James had arranged for them to have the same table where they had sat on that momentous night. As they ate dinner, Sarah found herself transported back to that time when they were still new to each other, when everything was uncertain but full of promise. After dinner, James pulled out a small box and handed it to Sarah. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant shaped like a desert flower. Sarah looked at it in confusion, beautiful as it was, until James explained. "When I went back to look for you in the desert, before I found your tracks, I saw one of these flowers growing near where they had left you. It seemed impossible that something so delicate could survive in such a harsh place, and I thought of you. You survived when anyone else would have died. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into a new beginning. This necklace is to remind you of your strength and of how far we have come together." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as James fastened the necklace around her throat. "I do not know what to say. James, this is beautiful. You do not have to say anything. Just know that I love you as much today as I did when we stood before that preacher 20 years ago. More, even, because now I know what an incredible person you are. You are an amazing mother, a gifted teacher, and the best partner I could ever have asked for. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me." "Thank you for asking," Sarah replied, taking his hand across the table. "And thank you for following my tracks into the desert. Thank you for being the kind of man who would risk everything to help a stranger. You changed my life, James Dalton, and I will love you until the day I die." They stayed in Tucson for 3 more days, reliving their early days together and marveling at how much had changed. They visited the hotel where they had spent their wedding night, walked the streets where Sarah had felt such relief at being safe, and talked about the young people they had been and the life they had built. On the journey back to Colorado, Sarah found herself reflecting on the strange path her life had taken. If someone had told her 20 years ago, as she stumbled through the desert certain she would die, that she would end up here, happily married with 3 children and a life she loved, she would never have believed them. But it had happened, all because one good man had decided that helping a stranger was more important than minding his own business. When they arrived home, they were greeted with enthusiasm by their children. William had drawn a welcome home banner, Grace had prepared their favorite meal, and Daniel had taken care of all the ranch work so flawlessly that nothing had been neglected in their absence. Sarah and James looked at their children and then at each other, and Sarah saw her own thoughts reflected in James's eyes. They had done well. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of loss and injustice. Years continued to pass, bringing changes but also constants. Daniel married a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a practical and kind person named Emily, who fit perfectly into their family. They built a house on the property and started their own family, making Sarah and James grandparents to a lively grandson they named James after his grandfather. Grace did indeed go to Denver for further education, spending 3 years studying at a teaching college. She came home with new ideas and methods that she implemented in the schoolhouse, which had grown large enough to require a second teacher. She eventually married a doctor who came to the area, and they settled in a nearby town where Grace established another school. William discovered that his artistic talents could be practical as well as beautiful. He began illustrating books and selling his paintings to people throughout the region, developing a reputation that eventually spread beyond Colorado. He remained at home the longest, finally moving to Denver when he was 25 to pursue his art career more seriously. But he visited often and always said that the mountains and ranch were his greatest inspiration. Sarah eventually retired from teaching when she was in her late 50s, deciding that it was time to pass the torch to younger educators. She remained active in the community, though, and her former students often came to visit and share how she had influenced their lives. Many of them had gone on to college or successful careers, and they credited Sarah's dedication and belief in them for giving them the confidence to pursue their dreams. James continued working the ranch and managing their own small cattle operation until he was well into his 60s. Even after he officially retired, he could not stay away from the horses and cattle entirely, and he spent his days doing lighter work and teaching his grandson and other young people the skills he had accumulated over a lifetime. On the 40th anniversary of the day James had found Sarah in the desert, they decided to take a trip back to the area where it had all begun. It took some convincing for their now adult children to agree to let them go, worried about the journey being too difficult for their parents, but Sarah and James were determined. They wanted to see the place again, to stand where their story had started and reflect on everything that had come from that moment. They traveled slowly, taking several weeks to make the journey south. When they finally reached the area where Sarah had been abandoned, they asked their guide to leave them alone for a few hours. The desert had not changed much in 40 years, still harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. Sarah stood at the spot where she remembered falling to her knees all those years ago, and James stood beside her, his hand in hers. They were both older now, their hair gray and their bodies marked by the years, but the love between them was as strong as ever. "Can you believe it has been 40 years?" Sarah asked, looking around at the familiar landscape. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. I can still remember the fear, the certainty that I would die here. I remember the determination I felt when I decided to follow you," James said. "I did not know why it was so important, but something told me that if I let you die, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I had no idea that following your tracks would lead me to everything I had been searching for." Sarah turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered cheek in her hand. "You saved me, James. Not just my life, but my soul. You taught me that there was still good in the world, still people worth trusting. You gave me a family and a home and 40 years of happiness. How can I ever thank you for that?" "You already have," James said, covering her hand with his. "Every day we have had together has been a gift. Every moment with you and our children has been more than I ever dreamed possible. If I had to do it all again, I would not change a single thing." They stood together in the desert as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, just as it had 40 years earlier. But this time, Sarah was not alone and afraid. She was with the man she loved, the man who had given her a second chance at life, and as they watched the sunset together, she felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. "Let us go home," Sarah said finally. "Back to Colorado, to our family. This place holds memories, but our home holds our heart." James nodded and led her back to where their guide was waiting with the horses. As they rode away from the desert, Sarah looked back one last time at the place where she had almost died. It no longer held any power over her. It was just a place, and she had moved far beyond the broken, frightened woman who had stumbled through the sand all those years ago. The journey back to Colorado was slow and comfortable, and they arrived home to a surprise party organized by their children and grandchildren. The house was filled with laughter and love, with 3 generations gathered to celebrate Sarah and James's enduring love story. That evening, after all the guests had gone home, and it was just the 2 of them again, Sarah and James sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The mountains were dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky, and the air was cool and fresh. "I have been thinking," James said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about legacy and what we leave behind. We have built a good life here, raised good children, helped a lot of people. But what I am most proud of is this: us. The fact that we took a moment of cruelty and injustice and turned it into something beautiful. That is the real victory." Sarah smiled and leaned against his shoulder, just as she had done so many times over the years. "We did more than survive," she agreed. "We thrived. We built a life filled with love and purpose, and we proved that one person's choice to do the right thing can change everything. You could have ridden away that day in Tombstone. No one would have blamed you for not getting involved, but you chose to help, and that choice created all of this. I chose to help, James acknowledged, but you chose to survive. You chose to keep walking through that desert instead of giving up. You chose to trust me when I found you. You chose to build a life with me. We did this together, Sarah, every step of the way. They sat in silence for a long while, holding hands and watching the stars. They were both in their mid-60s now, aware that they had more years behind them than ahead. But neither of them was afraid. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and built something that would outlast them. Their children were happy and successful. Their grandchildren were healthy, and their legacy was secure. As the night grew late and the temperature dropped, they finally went inside to their bedroom, the same room they had shared for decades. As they lay in bed together, Sarah's head on James's chest and his arm around her shoulders, she felt overwhelmingly grateful for the life they had shared. "James," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes? If you had to do it all over again, follow a stranger into the desert and risk everything for someone you did not know, would you?" James was quiet for a moment, then she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "In a heartbeat," he said firmly, "because that stranger became my wife, my partner, the mother of my children, and the love of my life. Following you into that desert was the best decision I ever made." Sarah smiled and closed her eyes, feeling completely at peace. She had been cast out to die alone, abandoned by people she had thought were her community. But she had not died. She had been found by a cowboy with a good heart, and together they had built a life that exceeded her wildest dreams. Years continued to pass peacefully. Sarah and James grew older, their pace slower, but their love undimmed. They spent their days surrounded by family, watching their grandchildren grow, and eventually welcoming great-grandchildren into the family. The ranch they had built became a gathering place for the entire extended family, a place where everyone knew they were welcome and loved. When Sarah was 70, she published a small book about her experiences, titled Cast Out and Found. It was part memoir, part lesson about justice and compassion, and it found an audience throughout the West. Young women wrote to her, telling her how her story had inspired them to be brave. Men wrote to thank her for reminding them of the importance of doing the right thing even when it was difficult. The book became a small legacy of its own, ensuring that the lessons Sarah and James had learned would continue to inspire others. James lived to see his 75th birthday, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. He spent his final years happy and content, never regretting the path his life had taken. When he passed peacefully in his sleep, with Sarah holding his hand, the entire community came to pay their respects to a man who had been respected and loved by all who knew him. Sarah grieved deeply for the loss of her husband, her partner of more than 50 years, but she also celebrated the incredible life they had shared. She lived for another 8 years after James's death, spending that time with her family and continuing to write and teach in smaller ways. She never remarried, saying that she had already found the love of her lifetime and did not need another. When Sarah passed away at the age of 83, she was buried beside James on a hill overlooking their ranch, under 2 simple headstones that bore their names and the dates of their births and deaths. But those who knew their story understood that those simple stones represented something far more significant, a love that had overcome injustice, a partnership that had built something lasting, and a testament to the power of choosing compassion over indifference. Their children ensured that the story was passed down to each new generation. The tale of how Sarah was cast out into the desert to die alone, and how the cowboy James followed her tracks until he found her, became a family legend. But it was more than just a story. It was a reminder that one person's choice to do good could change the world, that love could flourish in the harshest circumstances, and that the worst moments of our lives could sometimes lead to the best chapters. The ranch remained in the family for generations, each successive owner taking pride in maintaining the legacy that Sarah and James had built. The schoolhouse that Sarah had established continued to operate, educating children and preparing them for lives beyond the ranch. And in the main house, on a prominent wall, hung one of William's paintings. It depicted a desert sunset, beautiful and terrible at the same time, with a single set of footprints leading across the sand. Following those footprints was a second set, slightly larger, and in the distance, the 2 sets of tracks came together and continued as one. Beneath the painting was a simple plaque that read, "Cast out to die, but found and saved by love, Sarah and James Dalton, who proved that choosing compassion can change everything. Their story became more than family history. It became a parable shared throughout the region about the importance of helping those in need, about the unexpected ways that love can find us, and about the resilience of the human spirit. Schools used it as a teaching example. Preachers referenced it in sermons about Good Samaritans and the importance of acting on our moral convictions. And every year, on the anniversary of the day James had found Sarah, the family would gather for a celebration of life and love, remembering the two remarkable people who had started it all. The legacy of Sarah and James Dalton was not measured in wealth or fame, though they had achieved a comfortable life and a certain amount of recognition. Their legacy was measured in the lives they had touched, the children they had raised, the students Sarah had taught, and the example they had set for how to live with integrity and love. They had taken a moment of profound darkness and transformed it into a lifetime of light. And so, their story ended not with the tragedy in the desert, but with the triumph of love over cruelty, of compassion over indifference, of two souls who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful together. They had faced hardship and injustice, had known loss and pain, but they had also known deep joy and enduring love. They had lived fully and well, and when their time on earth ended, they left behind a legacy that would continue to inspire for generations to come. The desert where Sarah had almost died remained harsh and unforgiving, but it no longer held any tragedy in the family's memory. Instead, it was remembered as the place where everything began, where a cowboy made a choice that would echo through time, where love first took root in the most barren of places. And that, perhaps, was the greatest triumph of all, taking a place of death and despair and transforming it into the birthplace of a love story that would never be forgotten. The end of Sarah and James's mortal story was not really an ending at all, but rather a transition into legend and memory, into lessons learned and values passed down. They had started as strangers, one cast out and one riding to the rescue, but they had become so much more. They had become partners, lovers, parents, grandparents, and eventually ancestors whose story would be told around dinner tables and campfires for as long as their descendants remembered to tell it. And they would remember, because some love stories are too powerful, too meaningful, and too instructive to ever be forgotten. Sarah and James had proven that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive, that even when cast out and left for dead, one could rise again stronger than before, that a single act of kindness could ripple outward in ways no one could predict, and that true love, once found, could endure any challenge and overcome any obstacle. Their journey from that desperate night in the desert to a lifetime of happiness together was complete. They had lived, loved, struggled, triumphed, and ultimately passed into that good night together, in spirit if not in body. And in doing so, they had created something that would never die, a story of hope, redemption, and the transformative power of love that would inspire anyone who heard it to be a little braver, a little kinder, and a little more willing to help a stranger in need. Because you never know when that stranger might become the most important person in your life. You never know when one small act of compassion might change the course of history, at least for one person. And you never know when a set of footprints in the desert might lead to a love that lasts forever. Sarah and James had learned those lessons and lived them every day of their lives together. And now, resting side by side on that hillside overlooking the ranch they had built and the family they had raised, their story was complete. Not ended, because truly great love stories never really end, but complete, full circle, from desert despair to mountaintop joy, from death sentence to life abundant, from alone to together, now and always. That was the story of Sarah and James Dalton, the woman who was cast out into the desert to die alone, and the cowboy who followed her tracks until he found her. It was a story about survival and salvation, about justice and injustice, about the harsh realities of the Old West and the tender possibilities of the human heart. But most of all, it was a love story, a beautiful, heartfelt, enduring love story that proved beyond any doubt that sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to us can lead directly to the best thing if we are brave enough to survive and open enough to accept help when it comes. And they had been brave, they had been open, and they had been rewarded with a lifetime of love that neither of them had thought possible on that night when James first found Sarah collapsed in the sand, dying of thirst and stripped of hope. From that desperate beginning, they had built a life that was rich in every way that mattered. They had loved deeply, raised their children well, contributed to their community, and left the world better than they had found it. What more could anyone ask from a life? What greater legacy could anyone hope to leave? Sarah and James had achieved something that many people search for their entire lives but never find: true partnership, enduring love, and a sense of purpose that gave meaning to every day. They had found it together, in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they had held on to it through everything life threw at them. Their story was complete, their legacy secure, their love eternal, and anyone who heard the tale of the woman cast out into the desert to die alone, and the cowboy who followed her tracks until he found her, could not help but be moved by the power of compassion, the resilience of hope, and the transformative magic of true love. Sarah and James Dalton had lived their love story to the fullest, and in doing so, they had created something that would never fade, a testament to the best parts of human nature, a reminder that good still exists in the world, and proof that love, when it is real and true and deep, can overcome absolutely anything. Their journey together was finished, but the impact of that journey would continue forever, inspiring others to be brave, to be kind, and to never give up hope, no matter how dark things might seem, because somewhere, always, there is a cowboy ready to follow the tracks. Somewhere, always, there is hope waiting to be found. Somewhere, always, there is love preparing to transform everything. Sarah and James had found all of that and more, and their happiness was complete. Their story had reached its perfect ending, not sad, not lonely, but full and complete and deeply satisfying. They had lived, they had loved, they had triumphed. And when their time came to rest, they did so together in spirit, having built a legacy that would endure for generations. They had taken the cruelty of that day in Tombstone and transformed it into decades of joy. They had taken a death sentence and turned it into a life abundant. They had taken despair and forged it into hope. That was their gift to the world, and it was complete.